Agricultural Business Chamber and the IDC say their Agribusiness Confidence Index has dropped dramatically this quarter. In fact, confidence levels are now at their lowest level since the hardest parts of the lockdown in 2020. In other words, businesses in the agricultural sector are very worried about business conditions going into the future. Wandile Sihlobo is the chief economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Wandile, good afternoon to you. Why are all of the people in the agribusinesses so miserable?
Absolutely, Stephen. This is worrying because the first thing to appreciate is that the sentiment in any sector of the economy over the long run usually predicts the trend of investments. So if this pessimism is persists for longer, then of course this would have implication for investments and the long-term growth. But the key factors that are underpinning the pessimism in the last quarter of this year are the usual issues that you have discussed on the show, the issues at the ports, the weakening municipalities, poor road and railway network, animal diseases that are in the country. These are just some of the aspects that all of the people that we survey, they were coming up and putting them forward. And of course, some of the aspects are outside of our control in South Africa, like the geopolitics and the threats then that presents to trade, as we are a sector that exports almost half of what we produce. So these are all of the aspects that the colleagues are worried about.
A lot of agriculture is actually about moving things. It's actually about the roads, which you've mentioned. It's Transnet, which is a huge problem as well. Is that really the big factor? I mean, there are other things which are harder to control. So avian flu is harder to control, for example.
I think, Stephen, some of these things, avian flu, it's harder to control, but there is some level of complacency that we have had as a country. For example, the manufacturing of the vaccine is one of the aspects that we have had. I mean, we had talked about the failures at OBP was one of those aspects. And when we talk about animal diseases, we're not only minimizing to the avian influenza, but looking comprehensively. For example, last year into this year, we've suffered with what we call the foot and mouth disease in South Africa, which was for the first time in 6 of our 9 provinces. At the same time, we're also struggling with what we call the African swine fever. In part, these show the weaknesses in our biosecurity system, ability to control the spread of the diseases, but also our capability to produce some of the vaccines. But I would say that this is not unique to South Africa, the diseases themselves. We see diseases in America, we see diseases in Europe, and elsewhere in the world. We think we work having our abilities in order to control this, and that's something that the government and the private sector needs to work on from next year going forward.
So obviously there are things that we can do to restore confidence. I mean, if, for example, Transnet has suddenly improved and maybe by February it suddenly improves. Unfortunately, roads, things like that are a big factor. Is El Nino a big factor as well?
El Nino is a factor, Stephen, but I would still go back to the point you just made now, because I made the point earlier to say we're exporting about roughly half of what we produce. But to be exact, in 2022, we exported about 51% of what we produced in value terms. So that just tells you then that the roads conditions, the railway line efficiency, the ports are at the heart of the profitability and the sustainability of the sector, which is why they weigh so hard on many people's minds. El Nino is something that we are worried about from production conditions looking into next year. But the friends at the South African Weather Service have painted a somewhat optimistic picture, because what they came out and said was like, look, we may get some fairly moderate or good rainfall, especially in the eastern and central South Africa between now up until March. And then El Nino could intensify from March going forward. And if then we take what they had said in one of their reports in consideration with the fact that soil moisture in general in South Africa has been good, one can assume that we may have a decent harvest. But what will be important is moving these products to export and moving them to processing plants across the country, which is why the network industry and the efficiencies of that is at the heart of the sentiments and the growth and the performance of the sector.
One of the things, Wandile, about confidence, and it really matters for farmers, is that if you have confidence in the future, you invest more. And the reason I say that it matters more for farmers, because that then impacts what they actually sow, literally the number of seeds that they sow. It literally impacts what kind of machinery they buy. It literally impacts what kind of crops they're expecting. So if they have low confidence, if they're miserable, as they are now, does that mean they're going to invest less money and we're going to produce less food?
This is what worries me, Stephen, now. And of course, we cannot draw much of the conclusion on a one quarterly data. We would have to see what the next 3 or 4 quarters look like. But your interpretation of the situation is 100% correct to say when there is pessimism, people are not going to put the money in the sector. And that weighs on the long-term prospects then of the sector. But I must be quick to say, you know, if you think back into 2021, 2022, the guys did put a lot of money. In fact, they borrowed some of the money from the banks and they put it in the sector, expanding in some of the farming practices, and they spending some of the money on tractors and machinery and all kinds of things that you need to boost productivity in the sector. But we would like to see those investments continuing going forward, which is why then this dampened sentiment is something that tends to worry us, especially in a sector that we all hold hope that it could continue to grow, create employment in rural South Africa, and some economic vibrancy in all of these areas that so badly need some activity.
Wandile Sihlobo, thank you, Chief Economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Do appreciate the time.